So we'll go ahead and share the screen, and so Peter, please jump in if we need to. So what is critical race theory and why do folks get so upset about it? And that's obviously we're Trinity, it's today, and that's me. Okay, so how did critical race theory start? And it's a legal theory that tried to explain why the civil rights movement appeared to get stuck after the victories of the 50s and 60s. While obviously some things were clearly better, many people of color seemed stuck in poverty, coping with police brutality, etc. There were a number of scholars who contributed ideas, but most of this stuff was read by other lawyers, law professors, law students, and historians and some other scholars, some social scientists. But it was pretty obscure. You had to go looking for it. It wasn't a huge, as far as I can tell, main thrust of anybody's legal studies or anything else. I know there's probably people in this group who may know more about CRT than I do. As far as the history of it is, if I don't have it right, or if you have anything to add, please put it in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll be glad to get more. But I also am trying to keep this really bare bones, because we could spend 3 hours on every single slide or every single point in a slide that I've got. So I'm trying to just move this a bit, but I also want to make sure I'm getting my information correctly. There we go. Oops, now I went too far. So what does CRT actually say? Well, one of the main components of critical race theory deals with structural racism. And structural racism is the idea that many of America's societal structures, for example, police, housing, education, medicine, a lot of different areas, were built on racist foundations years ago and continue to function as designed. They were designed to hurt people of color, and they still do so. And the main thing to remember about structural racism is it has nothing to do with individuals hating other individuals. Nobody has to be racist for structural racism to continue to harm people. And in fact, colorblind policies actually are detrimental, because what a colorblind policy says is, well, we don't hate anybody anymore. We're just going to keep the system the way it is. But the system was designed to be racist, and we haven't changed those structures yet. So I have an example of structural racism that's been in the news in the last week. That's a picture from that big fire that was in the Bronx on January 9th, so just last Sunday. Apparently it broke out from a space heater. As of Friday, I think it was, 19 people had died, including 9 children. It's officially listed as an accidental fire, meaning it wasn't arson. Nobody intended to burn down that building. And this is where structural racism comes in, because it appeared to be caused by a space heater. Well, many people would think, well, that's a personal failing on the part of the people who didn't pay attention to the space heater. We do know that space heaters are a leading cause of home fires in the wintertime. Many of these fires appear to affect poor people more. And at this point, I'm going more from race to class, but keep in mind that people of color tend to have higher levels in poverty than white people do. And that is a given in my analysis. And the minute I heard it, my thought was, why wasn't the landlord providing adequate heat to the apartment? But have you heard that analysis on any mainstream news? NBC, CBS, CNN, and any of the major papers? Did anybody talk about the question of how much heat was the landlord providing? Because if they were using space heaters because the landlord wasn't providing adequate heat, who is to blame? New York City law requires that landlords provide adequate heat to all apartments. It's also well known that in poor neighborhoods, many landlords flaunt that law with impunity. What do they get fined? A couple $100 if they get caught and if anybody pursues it? We all know the answers to those questions. Because if the landlords who rent to poor people can abuse them, in this case by not providing adequate services like heat, who is to blame for damage that results? The renter, who was just plugging in a space heater and because it just doesn't like freezing to death? The landlord, who didn't turn up the heat enough to keep the apartments at a comfortable temperature? Or the system that allowed the landlord to get away with it? And when we talk about structural racism, we're talking about those systems and structures that allow people to abuse other people, especially people of color. We've certainly all seen that in the police. For my entire lifetime, I'm almost 62. Hasn't changed. Peter, there's somebody in the chat. Do we have a question?
A comment from Wendy, so true.
Yes. You read it or have Wendy read it?
The comment says, so true. It confirms what you are saying.
Okay. Just want to make sure if anybody's got a question or a comment, I want to get on that. So we've seen it. We see apartments in minority areas that are not taken care of properly. And we see police targeting especially young men of color. We see we see so many structures that these are not aberrations. They are working exactly as they were designed. So attacking one landlord for not providing heat might be a start, but we've got to admit that there's systems here. There are systems and structures that are not allowing, that are oppressing people of color. And until we change those structures, the oppression is not going to stop. Okay. Structural racism. Now, let me get... There we go. Nope, now I went too far. Okay. So, given that we now have an idea of what we're talking about, what CRT really involves at the academic level, a lot of the conversation on CRT does deal with the structural issues. A lot of it is what academics love the word intersectional, which means that we experience many things from a number of different lenses. For example, I'm a white woman of a certain age. I'm 61. So when I have an experience, I'm processing it through the lens of being female, through the lens of being white, and through my generation. And, when I, both at the college and some of the other jobs I've held, I've worked with a lot of younger people. And a lot of times I'm asking them, okay, this is how people, I see this. How do you see this? You're younger, or you're from a different ethnic group than I am, or a different religion, and try to, find out. But if you hear the term intersectional, that's what it's talking about. And the term was starting to be used by Black women. The person who really started writing about this, her last name is Crenshaw, and she's a law professor. She's African-American woman. And so she's writing about the intersection of both being Black and being a woman. And also, as we get older, certainly generation. But none of these protests that you see at your school board meetings or in your state legislatures are talking about structural racism for much. They're certainly not talking about intersectionality, or if they mention the terms, it's very clear that they don't know what they mean in an academic context, what the lawyers meant, what the historians and social scientists mean by that. The protests seem to be focused on any teaching about racism or civil rights, and that any attempt to teach about the history of race in the US is divisive or divisive, depending on how you pronounce that word. My answer, of course, is it doesn't need to be. But any teaching that makes conservative whites uncomfortable is labeled a CRT. I spent a lot of years as a history teacher. My job, as I saw it, was to make my students uncomfortable almost every day. Most of my students really appreciated it because it made them think. I wasn't trying to diss anybody in particular, but you tell me how we can teach the Trail of Tears without making most white men of the period look not real nice. I haven't figured out how to do that yet. And for an example of a comeback to this is there's a couple of memes that have been making the rounds, and for the life of me, of course, when I go looking for them, I can't find them, that showed some of the classic pictures of Black nonviolent protesters being attacked, like at Greensboro in the sit-ins, or the freedom rides across the South on the buses, or just people screaming with really ugly racist signs. And of course, the joke is the older Southerners don't want to teach about civil rights because they don't want their grandchildren asking why grandma's in the picture. And I think this is not a world's worst point. Is that why older whites don't want these events discussed in public schools? It can get ugly when you've got the immediate descendants of people on one side and the other side in the same classroom in a public school. So that is why I think a lot of people are so upset. And what I'd like to do now is just break it into a discussion. I'd like to hear people's thoughts, especially if any of you have taught and you deal with these issues in a classroom setting. But even if not, I'm going to I'm just going to show you my last, and I'll come back to my last slide at the end, which is actually just talking about next week's class. So I'm going to stop the share. We'll go back and go ahead and you can either unmute yourselves or you can raise a hand or use the chat, and Peter will help me keep track of it all. But I'd really like to know what people are thinking. And also any questions you have, because as I said, I tried to make that as basically as quick a definition as I possibly could, but I do have more information, and I'm sure others on this screen have a lot more information as well.
Phyllis, I found your idea that even though people may not be racist, systems are independently racist interesting, and I hadn't thought of that. First of all, for any of us to proclaim that we're not racist, I think is a bit of a stretch. We'll work on it to the best of our abilities, but tribalism is alive and well, I think. And I would be very interested to hear from people of color how they find hope in an era where we can't even discuss racism and systems are racist independent of people as well.
Okay, there's somebody's got like a TV on in the background, and if you could mute yourself, unless you're actually speaking, that would be helpful. Thank you.
I'm going to mute everybody. Phyllis, you may have to unmute
Yeah,
yourself,
I think
please.
I was a little premature
And
there.
when you speak, please unmute yourselves first.
Calculated job value.
Get myself unmuted here. So please either raise your hand or unmute yourself, or just if you don't want to speak, just put it in the chat, and Peter will help me with that. But yeah, Ken has the whole point of structural racism is that nobody has to hate anybody for it to work, just like it's designed to. Is that we have racist systems in this country, and analyzing what those systems are, their histories, that's where the historians like me come in, is looking back at these histories and saying, how did it get to be this way? Why is it this way? And then working with the communities to say, okay, this is what's happening. It's affecting people of this group or that group disproportionate to their percentage or in this area. One of the definitions of racism is when people of any ethnic group suffer disproportionate consequences. So if more Black drivers are pulled over than white drivers in proportion to their percentage in the community, well, that looks pretty racist. If incomes are really disparate, that's that can be racist as well. If all the kids, if a lot of the kids in one ethnic group go to a certain school and that school is substandard, why is it substandard, and where do we go? What contributes to that?
Phyllis, Wendy has her hand up. Well, Wendy has her hand up.
Okay, Wendy, unmute yourself and jump in.
Hello there. So I agree with everything that you have said. My personal experience has been that using the word racism or being racist is always misinterpreted as a personal affront. And so therefore no one can see the systemic problems that emanate from having this preconceived stereotypical notions. So what I have found helpful is to use the term systemic oppression. And therefore, those that are resistant may lean in and listen a little bit more than starting with everyone is racist.
I totally agree. And I think racist is one of those words like Nazi that has outlived its usefulness as an honest term of honest discussion, as opposed to an epithet we throw at people.
Right.
So I totally agree with my screen. Everybody keeps moving around. So I totally agree with you, Wendy. And I think we need to come up with some different terms. And systemic oppression is a good one.
Another quick thought is regarding the comment about how people of color feel about all this. It's something that we have all learned to deal with and survive with. And so therefore you're on a continuum of ignoring it sometimes, placating the white fragility that is surrounding us. And as a consequence, sometimes we can't even see it. Otherwise we would go crazy. So it cannot be ever present on your mind, even though we are living and are surrounded with it 100% of the time.
Yeah, you can't, because exactly. On a different issue, somebody once had to ask me one time how I dealt with a situation that was for me much the same. And I had to say, I don't ever think about it.
Yeah.
I think about it if it comes up, but no, I don't waste my time worrying about it when it's not right in front of me, because you know what? I've got a life to live. And so I would assume that any mentally healthy person just basically just tries to go about living their life as much as possible. I could be wrong on that, but that seems to be what I've noticed in my life.
Mm-hmm. Although then it speaks to the angry young Black male that seems to be so misunderstood. And, and then it's the straw that breaks the camel's back sometimes. They have no other outlet other than to act out, perform, if you will, to find some level of self-gratification.
I understand that. When my response to the angry Black male is, of course he's angry. Is he not? He's not stupid. He should be angry. And, and then like anything else, it's trying to channel that anger into something productive. But the fact that people are angry should be a given. One of the things, and we're going to talk more about this next week, what we're going to do next week is Father Glenn and I are going to be running, we're going to do a brainstorming session, and I'll show you the last slide real quick, because it shows what we're going to talk about. And if we go on to the last slide here, we're going to talk about things we can do as individuals to be more aware of structural racism, and what can we do as individuals to make changes. And then we want to talk about the parish here in Binghamton. What can we do in our own communities? For those of you who aren't here in Binghamton or aren't members at Trinity, what can you do in your own community, or what are you doing? What has worked in your communities to just help with this awareness issue? And that's next week. But one thing I'll share is that I became very aware of teaching basic American history survey. The old American history from, the foundations to the Civil War, or Civil War to the current, that standard gen ed college class that everybody has to take at some point. I taught it for a lot of years, both halves of it. And the one thing that became exceedingly obvious to me many years ago was the assumption that white European colonial settler colonialism, that whole mindset, is the default. And I don't know if I did anything to change anybody's mind, other than I marked them down for it on their drafts and said, no, this isn't how we discuss this. And in my own speaking and lecturing, I was very conscious that if there was any term where, if it was a person of color or a person of Asian descent or a Native American, that I would have said Black or Native American or African American. If it was that kind of context and we were talking about a white person, I always said white. The white newspapers said this. The white government officials did that, because I wanted to help my students at some point understand that being white isn't the fault. It's just one other, perspective. And And that, and I don't know if it changed anybody. I don't even know if my students ever noticed it. I'm pretty sure my students of color noticed it from some of the responses I got. And I think they usually appreciated it because I wasn't centering white European descent Americans as the default. And if people did that in their writing, I usually called them on it and asked them to rephrase it for future projects or final draft. That was one little thing I could do, but if anybody else has done other things, we could discuss that now, but we're also going to discuss that more next week.
I had a wonderful experience through Susan Sherwood of sending me a link to a program that discussed food inequity. And it brought to my mind, it talked about a place in Philadelphia where they work so hard to make sure good, fresh food is provided to everyone, not just those that could afford it in a fine grocery store, but also other locations. And after listening to it, I thought, holy smokes, Binghamton is on deck. They, number one, let's start with our church and the fact that the meals right now, COVID has altered just exactly what is cooked for our canteen program, but we have been cooking good food for people. Number one. Number two, the Vines program. The Vines program, with all the gardening that's going on, is making sure that healthy food is available. And number three, I'll think of in a minute. I had it in my mind. I just, whoops, no, I've lost it. Guess what? Oh, shoot, I wish I could think of it right now. Okay, I'll pop in again. But our Vines program, our own Trinity program, are working at this. Oh, I know, the Good Food Grocery.
Yeah, that I was just going to mention the grocery store that the Council of Churches is running over off State Street.
Yes,
and
so
that
I
was
think that I think we are on the road to being able to make some inroads, some good progress. I'll hang up now.
Rick, what did you have to say?
Phyllis, you used the term active, and I think for me, this white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, it's all about perspective. And my anecdote for context is, I noticed many years ago that young Black men were wearing their pants with the waist down around their mid-thigh. And I scratched my head and said, well, I hope they don't fall down. That's a very awkward way to wear your pants. And I thought, that's actually kind of stupid. What's going on here? So when I learned that for some, it is a protest of the percentage of Blacks in prison, and that when you're in prison, you must take off your belt in your pants to dangle around your thighs. Every time I'd see a young Black man with his pants down around his thighs, I think of the injustice, overrepresentation of Blacks in our prisons. So that's changed my perspective. And there are many other things in my study of geography, learning about redlining, and some of these institutional systems. And was it Wendy's comment? Rather than use the term racism, it's oppression. And it's meant to keep the rich people rich and the poor people poor. These are the systems that I hope to vote for elected officials to change. Perspective.
One of the things that we want to talk about next week, and then Michael, I think you had your hand up, is that one of the things we want to talk about is what can we do today that doesn't, I mean, obviously we want to vote. But, and work on that. But what can we do as a parish and as individuals today? Because one of the things I talked to Glenn about is I don't want to workshop this. I don't want a study group. My God, we've had study groups on race since before I was born in the Episcopal Church. That's been 60 plus years. We don't need another study group. What we need is some action. And I'm tired of waiting for the politicians. And I think most of us are. That yes, I vote, I do all that. Don't get me wrong on that. But what can we do in our own community, right here in Binghamton or wherever any of us live, to start improving things? And that's what I'm hoping that next week, if you can all come back and join us, I want to know what's worked in your community or in your life or your family or your group, especially for those who don't live here in Binghamton. And what was a failure? We can talk about failure because most of what we've tried has been failure. Good God, I'm 60 years old and I remember some of my earliest memories of television as a kid is Bull Connor and his water cannons. I was like 3 or 4, I was little kid, but that's some of my earliest memories of television news is the water cannons on kids that weren't much bigger than me. And as a kid, my sympathy was with the children, not those mean white men who had their dogs and water cannons. They were awful. The little kids, what did they ever do? I mean, I was in trouble all the time because I was a hyperactive little kid who never paid attention to my mom. But, I'm still seeing, people protesting and being attacked, if not by water cannons and dogs. Just look at everything that happened after George Floyd.
Well, Phyllis,
somewhere, but I don't see enough progress. And
yeah,
it just really annoys me. To put it
Phyllis,
yeah,
Phyllis, was it Michael Hassan that was going to speak?
yes, Michael, yes, go
Okay.
ahead, please.
Yeah.
Professor, what I'd like to get your thoughts on are these problems that we've been discussing, that you've been discussing, are they completely attached to race, or is there an overall problem with the economic system of racism? And I'm asking that question really for 2 reasons. There is a political theory that's being pretty much promulgated by my ex-academic advisor, Dr. Adolph Reed, around this whole notion of race reductionism, okay, and the need to focus on capitalism. Okay, so I'd be interested in getting your thoughts on where you stand on that, because it seems to be a pretty prevalent argument, certainly within the academic community.
My answer is yes, both.
Okay.
I don't think you can separate them because of the history of racism in this country and the deliberate systems put in place to keep people of color poor. There's obviously, in that case, a both and. It's both economics, but I would also completely argue that economics, because one of the things that CRT says is that when white people, at least groups of white people, can realize that they have a common cause with African-American, groups of African-American people, progress can be made because they will work together. And one example, and Dr. King tried to do this a lot. He was always talking about, he didn't talk about the Black people's campaign, he talked about the poor people's campaign. And he was constantly trying to help poor white people and poor Black people realize that the system was on top of, was against both of them. And if they could work together, then perhaps some progress could be made. And so for me, it's not an either or, it's a both and, because I certainly see how capitalism is making life difficult for lots of poor white people. Because I never taught full time, I always have had a second job. And for a long time, I worked for Wegmans Supermarket. I worked for them like for 11 or 12 years. And I knew what it was like to work with people of white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, and we were all trying to get by on not much better than minimum wage. And Wegmans actually treated its employees fairly decently for that kind of industry, but just the same, I mean, we were all in the same boat. We were all trying to get by on not much money. So, Michael?
Also, if I may break in, Wendy has a important message in the chat. Wendy, would you be so kind to speak to it?
Yes, hi. I just wanted to share that there in New York City this past year, there has been a commission, a racial justice commission, and they just issued 4 ballot proposals that are going to be on the upcoming November ballot. Now, it's specifically related to equity among New York City residents, but it's something that I think we all should read and look at and become familiar with. And perhaps it could be adopted by New York State as well. That was one thought that I put in the chat. You can get more information either going directly to New York City Racial Justice Commission and or through an organization that I'm on the board of, which is called fpwa.org. So that was one thought. Another thought is, if you really want to understand the historical, the history behind systemic oppression, racial injustice in this country, try reading a book entitled White Rage by Carol Anderson.
She's terrific. I've read some of her articles.
Yeah.
And stuff, and in a website that she had, at least at one point. I haven't looked at it in a while. Yeah, she had she's got, I drew a lot of stuff from her on when I was dealing with miscegenation and lynching because of the whole Black rape myth. And by the way, if you ever want to teach a class on lynching and you want to help white kids understand the how people can get caught up in a lynch mentality who are otherwise decent people. The lynching scene from Beauty and the Beast, where Gaston works up the entire community to go kill the beast, the Kill the Beast song, is the best I have ever come across. Because the whole mentality of how decent, nice people can get caught up into that mentality and go to attack somebody. I've never seen it better illustrated in less than 5 minutes.
Wow. You know, that kind of reminds me, even the systemic racism that is found throughout all Disney productions. That would be a great course, you know, to do an analysis of stereotypes, imagery, and prejudice among Disney works.
I just was reading a post by a friend of mine out in California who said that sometime recently he'd been watching some 70s Disney movies with his kids and made a comment of, oh my God, I didn't remember how racist they were. Because he was just a kid at the time himself. He's quite a number of years younger than I am. And he was white. He was raised with it. He never thought twice of it. And now he goes back and watches it 30 years later and he goes, oh my God.
Frightening.
Yeah, Catherine or Bailey, did she have Catherine, did you have a comment? I saw something pop up.
Well, no, I mean, I try to just capture it in the chat. But
Okay.
literacy education is my background, and that intersectionality of race and class and disability too. And we, it's been mentioned a few times, the, substandard schooling and substandard approaches in schooling is definitely something that I'm a former principal and a former curriculum director. And now I work with all the schools in the region. So it's perpetually an issue, and it's perpetually an issue I work with a lot of nice people, right? There are a lot of people, I mean, they're doing what they're doing because they want to help kids, but turning the lens back on our historic practices and how they may be favoring some and leading to, in this particular case, lower levels of literacy for others. It's a real concern. And, a lot of many of those very nice people, that work in education, sometimes we don't want to turn that lens back on ourselves and see how our practices might have disenfranchised people who don't look like us. So thanks.
Exactly. Thank you for commenting, because that is so true. And one of the things that really changed at Rome while I was teaching there is when they built the dorms. We got a lot more kids up from the city, and many of them were the racial mix in my classes changed. And it was interesting to hear both from students and faculty. Most of us thought it was wonderful. It brought just a whole different way of viewpoints, and it certainly made me very conscious of how I was teaching about race. That when I've got 4 African-American students sitting in my 20 students as opposed to 0, which often might have been the case years ago, it made me more conscious. And I actually really liked that, because it made me really think through how I was doing things and how I was presenting things. And I thought it made me a much better teacher. But my God, you should have heard some of my, and honestly, they're unnamed colleagues, because I made a point of not remembering who they were. I just didn't want to just go there. But there were some frictions, there were some tensions. I don't think most of it was racial so much as the city versus Binghamton, the country. I think it was as much or more that as anything specific. And I think the Black kids all recognized it as more city versus upstate, but a lot of the white kids immediately put it in terms of race. And it was, and I'm like, this really isn't the issue, folks. This is just 2 different cultures. I had a lot of white kids at BU from the city, and they were much more like my Black kids from the city than they were like my white kids from Binghamton sometimes. Because it was the culture they came from, not what their face looked like. And but trying to convince some of my colleagues and not all of the students, not even a majority of them, but some of them, got interesting. Any real final thoughts? Anybody's waiting to share?
This is Ike.
Ike,
Go ahead, Ike.
A lot of good information come out in the program today. But think about what's going on in the public school system now. How can we get some of the information into the school system, into our trainers and lead teachers there?
So Ike is a Binghamtonian, and he represents our AME Zion Church. Ike, where is the church exactly? Tell me again. Where's AME Zion?
Church at Oak and Lydia Street in Binghamton.
Lydia Street. Okay.
It's Oak, just north of. You can't get there on Oak from Trinity Memorial. You have to go around.
Go down Clinton.
Through, but and one of the things I'm going to be talking about to the DAR next month is I'm going to be talking about Jermaine Logan, who was a pastor at the AME Zion Church back in the 1870s, I believe. I have to check my dates on that.
Yeah.
And his daughter helped set up one of the first schools for African-American children in the Binghamton area. So I'll be mentioning AME Zion to the DAR next month.
But how can
And,
we get
and I'm
some,
always so glad to make those connections with history. So,
but how can we get some information today into the school system for the problem we have in the school system there now?
well, let's talk about that next week, because we're
Okay.
going to be, next week's going to be brainstorming. I'm going to have a document up. I'm going to be typing out ideas. Glenn's going to be leading the discussion. We're still working on the technical details of how we're going to do this remotely. Initially, we had hoped to be in the same room, and I was going to have the big whiteboard, and people could be online, but we have a camera on the on the flip board, and we could be writing stuff down. And now I think I'm going to be typing it on a document on the screen. But that's what we want to do next week is just come up with concrete ideas that not all of them could work. We really don't care, but we just want some ideas and some ways we can think. So I
Yes.
thank you all for coming. Glenn, what do you want to finish us with?
Well, I just wanted to finish it with I think it was very helpful to listen to some perspectives of Black people and what they're looking at, what they're seeing, and I think we need to hear a whole lot more of that. One of the things that I'm interested in is because I'm ignorant about some issues of Binghamton, but is there still redlining going on in Binghamton? I guess that's a question that I'd like some information on. Is there still? My guess is in terms of economic oppression, is that still happening in the banking industry in Binghamton? Some of those areas, the educational system in Binghamton, those are some of the areas that I really would like us to look at next week a little bit and to see how we might have any kind of effect on those kind of systems. But I think first I need to know, are some of those things actually still happening? I think the economics most certainly is. I think the school district to some degree. So, if that's food for thought, people might do a little looking into it and seeing what the reality is these days.
Glenn, my mother made a video about my mother tried to rent an apartment right in our neighborhood and was turned away, and a white person was able to rent the same apartment. So this is something that has been seared into her memory, but it happened decades ago. I don't know whether it's still a problem, but you see, Ike and Connie Studgeon are stalwart community people, and they have their hand in the civil rights issues in Binghamton. So they're also leaders at AME Zion Church. So you have them here, and I would hope that we can do something with AME Zion. And I tried to instigate that in the past. Now, the other thing I wanted to ask is about the program for Black History Month, because we have my aunt and my cousin and 4 of my friends have come. So they're all very interested in our programs and what we might be doing for Black History Month. Have we got an agenda as yet, John?
Actually, yeah, I mean, we did not do a specific program for Black History Month.
Okay, all right.
This is sort of
This
it.
would fill in what we have.
Yeah, this is Martin Luther King weekend, and you did a great job, Phyllis. As you always do.
Thank you.
So Adrian,
No worries.
it is that we do see race-related issues as absolutely critical that have to be raised again and again. Sometimes, actually, your mother once got after me for saying we always had to put things in Black History Month. She said it ought to be all times of the year, and she's right. So in any case, that is the case. Next month, we are going to have a series on technological innovations in the area, particularly related to energy and climate change and so forth. And then we have in the spring, we're hoping to do a series on issues of mental health. that and certainly have implications in terms of the racial balance and I mean sort of the different groups that are impacted by that, although it will not be specifically addressed to race. So those are the plans. And again, for next year, we are absolutely open to more kind of creative ideas as to how to do things. And I hope your input, Adrian, will be crucial on that.
John has been trying to pull me into that committee for a long time.
Can't hear you.
But thank
Yes,
you,
we have.
everybody.
Yes, we have, Adrian. I will.
I know. Every week. Yeah, you're pulling me. But my friends who've come, who this is their first time, we do have a list of previous videos, and we had some outstanding presentations last year for Black History Month. And so I'll share some of those links with you. And please come back next week because Ike has already got a list of people to invite for next week. He's busy working on that. Yeah.
That's great.
Well,
Would it
just
be a
keep in mind-
possibility? This is, can I just say before we leave, would it be a possibility next week for Ike to have part of the time to make a presentation of what he sees as some of the poignant issues that we should be dealing with and how we might be helpful?
Works for me.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I would love to hear the perspective of AME Zion, and some of the things that because they really are dealing with the frontline stuff,
Okay, well, I'll definitely pursue that offline. I'll ask about that.
Okay.
Mhm.
And Adrian, you've got, if you've gotten any of John's emails, you have Glenn's email, you have mine. Feel free to rope us into any emails you want. Just, because I had told Glenn, I said, let's just sort of play this loose. We're looking for concrete, we're looking for ideas, we're looking for ways we can partner with people. And we didn't have a lot of preconceptions, if I remember my emails to Glenn correctly.
Yep. Very true. Very true. Yep.
Excellent idea, Glenn.
Yep.
Glenn, could you take us out with a word of prayer, and then we can go ahead and just let everybody go?
Sure. Oh, Lord, be with us so that we can appreciate the gifts that each one of us brings to the table. Help us to see our diversity as a strength. Help us to see our acceptance of one another as a part of your kingdom in this world. Be with us this day and this week as we walk the walk you've given us. For we ask in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. And we'll see you all next week at 12 o'clock
Thanks so much. Yeah.
or before.
Thank you.
Amen.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.